This is Carrie Wilson, and she will be talking about inbreeding and genetic diversity that she has been very intimately engaged in over time. So I'll turn it over to Carrie.
Thank you. Thanks, Ron. So the concept of genetic diversity is the variation present in a population. So as we look across all of the sheep breeds that are part of sheep gems, or even if we think about the sheep breed as a whole, of course, we can see that there's a wide range of genetic variation. As easy as it is to think about the genetic diversity between breeds, in reality, when we look at sheep on an individual level, there's actually more variation within a breed than there is between breeds. So some studies have shown somewhere in the neighborhood of 83 to 93% of the total variation actually exists within a breed. And that gives us tremendous opportunity for genetic improvement. So the foundation of animal breeding is something that we refer to as the breeder's equation. And that includes the levers that we have available to impact change in our flocks. So these levers include the accuracy of selection, which Tom talked about quite a bit, and that's, you know, how close the true value is to our predicted value when we're looking at breeding values. Also, selection intensity, which is how choosy we can be with our animals. And we can be a lot choosier with rams because we need so few of them than with selecting our ewe replacements. Also, genetic variation. So what is that full range? If we're interested in a trait in particular, what is that full range of breeding values that we have available to select from? And the final part of the equation is generation interval, which is how rapidly we turn over, how rapidly parents are replaced by their offspring. So primarily, we're going to focus on that genetic variation component. So having sufficient genetic variation in a population gives us the opportunity to select animals that meet our needs, and these needs can change over time. So we really need that reservoir of variation to exist in order to make those changes. So I like these pictures of Angus cattle over time. So the first picture in 1965, when they were first imported, if you look at the people in the background, those Angus cattle are like at people's waist, right? So we would probably consider those to be miniature cattle today. And then, 20 years later, if you look at the people in the background, that bull is towering over their head. And then in 2015, they're back to something a little bit more moderate. So what's interesting about this is that we can visually see how genetic change has happened over time. So we have exploited those changes in beef cattle to meet changes in consumer demands, presumably, but also these classic broiler photos show how we have become far more efficient over time using genetic selection. So these pictures, this is a control, and this is a selected broiler at different time endpoints. And you can see just how efficient we've become at selecting for genetic improvement and making our industry so much more efficient over time. So what's interesting is, if we take a look back in time, when we select the best animals, we are typically selecting for sire lines that are actually related, which leads to an increase in inbreeding. So inbreeding is the probability that a pair of that both alleles in a pair are identical by descent, or that they came from a common ancestor. So we hear a lot about inbreeding, but what does it really mean to our bottom line? So I think of inbreeding in terms of intentional inbreeding, which is like line breeding, and unintentional. And I just kind of wanted to give a little background on historic line breeding. Back in like the 50s and 60s, there's a lot of interest in creating these highly inbred populations. And the idea was that it would help perpetuate superior dominant genetics. And the most successful example that I am aware of is the line 1 Hereford, which was developed by ARS in Miles City. And this bull here, his daughter, one of his, I'm sure many daughters, Dominette, was used for developing one of the first bovine reference genomes. And the reason she was selected was because she was 30% inbred. And so that made the reference genome a lot easier to develop because she was so homozygous. And also, the line 1 is still part of more than half of all Hereford pedigrees. So heavily influenced of that line. And I wanted to go talk a little bit about this concept of prepotency. It's almost like Tom and I coordinated it. The idea that was really a lot of the interest in the line breeding was that the animals would be more uniform and you could predict how the offspring would perform. So I'm going to go over an example of if you have a really highly inbred animal who's more homozygous. So those were his loci, where he's homozygous at A, C, and D, and heterozygous at B. His only allele combinations that he can pass on to his offspring, there's only 2 options. If we look at a non-inbred animal who's more heterozygous, this bull is only he's heterozygous at 3 and only homozygous at 1. And so he can pass on a possible of 8 allele combinations. So you can see how the inbred animal would produce a lot more uniform offspring than the non-inbred bull. So that's sort of the extreme example of line breeding. But the other type of inbreeding is really more the slow accumulation that happens in our flock. And that's more what we deal with. If this isn't kept in check, it can lead to inbreeding depression, which we usually see as lower survival and fertility. And our goal is not to have zero inbreeding. It's just something that we should be aware of. And the key is to manage it through our mating decisions. So I couldn't find any current estimates of how much inbreeding costs, but my predecessors at the sheep experiment station did all these inbred line studies in the 50s. And in the 90s, Erkenbrack and Knight did an economic analysis of the impact of inbreeding on production. And they found that ewes that were using lambs that were 20% inbred lost $17 per ewe, which is $39 in today's value. And ewes that were 50% inbred lost $36 per ewe, which is $83 in today's value. And the impacts on reproduction, weaning weight, and fleece weight cost so much that they concluded that inbreeding was really more of a detriment than the benefit that they had hoped for. So if we go back to the concept of the breeder's equation, when we move towards genomic selection, we're going to increase that accuracy of selection because now we have information on young animals. We don't have to wait so long. Selection intensity, you can make the case that you may be able to increase it or it may stay the same. We know that genetic variation will decrease because people are better able to make decisions that will basically reduce genetic variation because we're going to choose the same animals. And it has led to an increase in inbreeding across the other species that have implemented genomic selection. And you can make the case that it would decrease your generation interval. I think that also depends on your flock objectives. For us, we are hoping on the ewe side that these novel traits are actually going to help us extend the life of the ewe, and then we'll make more rapid genetic turnover on the ram side. So our generation interval may actually increase. But just to go back to the concept of genomic selection in other species, in Holstein, here's a Wall Street Journal article where they point out that all Holsteins are essentially cousins. And ABS reported that their inbreeding level is at 9%. And what's even more concerning is that the rate of inbreeding continues to increase. ABS reported that every 1% increase in inbreeding leads to a $25 reduction in profitability. So here's a graph from the CDCB showing net merit over time with Holsteins, and their net merit would be the equivalent of using one of our NSIP indexes. So here, when they first implemented genomic selection, average gain of net merit was somewhere around $40 per year. And after they implemented genomic selection, it had doubled to $80. So they saw a major increase in net merit from implementing genomic selection. And they attributed this gain, going back to the breeder's equation, to increased selection accuracy, back here, selection intensity, and then decreased generation interval. So the Holstein example kind of gives us, highlights why it's important for us to look at genetic diversity before we implement genomic selection. So with the sheep gems breeds, we've done a pretty thorough analysis using molecular and pedigree-based evaluations, and our inbreeding is quite a bit lower than what you would see with like the Holstein example. So just kind of wrap things up, I wanted to return to the idea of how we can use mating systems to manage inbreeding and introduce the concept of optimal contribution selection. And this concept is considered the gold standard for maximizing genetic gain while restricting average relatedness. And to go back to the earlier discussion about which animals to genotype, you can also use this same concept to determine which animals to genotype. And that's exactly what I have done with our flock. And especially for people who are looking for a black and white answer instead of a gray answer, I'm happy to talk some more about using these tools. So there's a free package in R that you can use, but also Brian Kinghorn out of Australia has software available called MateCell. And it's already been integrated with sheep genetics in Australia and is freely available to their clients. So this is something that I would like to see available to us in NSIP, and really in order to get the maximum benefit from genomic selection. And that's something that I would like to hear thoughts on and see if that's something that should be a priority as we move forward with Sheep Gems 2.0. And with that, I'll take any questions. Thank you.
Questions for Carrie?
Thanks, Gary. Great presentation. Just quickly, you reported the pedigree-based inbreeding. Do you have any information on the genomic inbreeding and how that may be different?
Yes. So are you interested in the Bramble specifically? It's pretty similar. I think they've all been published except for the Bramble. So very similar. Yeah, there's nothing that would raise any concerns.
Just a general comment on that, if I may. The tendency will always be that genomic inbreeding will be higher than pedigree-based inbreeding. And the reason is we're building in genomic relationships that we miss with pedigree. Pedigree is all based on what you write down on a piece of paper and what we think it is. With genomics, we're adding in what's happening at the genome level. So they were similar, but they tended to be just a little bit higher with the genomic estimates.
You talked about newborn in the 50s and the reduction in profit by percent inbreeding. What selection criteria was used to do those matings to produce that those numbers, or was it just an increasing amount of inbreeding and see what happened?
It was before my time. But no, I think it was really about maintaining those highly inbred lines. And part of the success was they were having a hard time finding replacements because the reproduction was so poor. So they just kept narrowing the pool. But I don't think it was selection for higher weaning weight or anything like that. It was really about those inbred lines.
My question was that Angus slide, and what was the impact of blood? Because 88 would have been right at the start of blood, right? And then, so were the Angus people taking into account more blood to reduce the size, or do you think?
I think that was a market demand, right? That they just kept selecting for bigger and bigger animals, and then eventually the consumers don't want that big of a steak, and then they came back to something more moderate.
So it wouldn't have to do with any of the maternal traits.
Certainly could have. I mean, that size, it is.
You've been pulling every calf.
Yeah.
I hear a lot of things about all the mistakes are made in the beef industry, and we don't want to repeat that in the sheep industry, blah, blah, blah. It's impossible. We're doomed to failure because the cattle people did that. The Angus issue was, they selected for they selected yearling weight EPD, which, as we all know, is correlated with so many other things, which made for a giant animal. And then they had to develop calving ease bulls to bring that animal down. So it's just like chasing the tail.
That's exactly right.
And that's my understanding. But my actual question is related to the Holstein example. You said there's a 1% for every 1% increase in inbreeding coefficient, we see a reduction in profitability
Of $25.
$25 decrease in profitability. Do you know where that comes from? How the profitability drops? I mean, what's causing this? Like milk production? What's the source of that loss of revenue?
It's all the inbreeding, all those factors that go into inbreeding depression. It's primarily going to be, maybe she has a better answer, but primarily going to be on the reproduction side.
To quote Tom Murphy from a couple of years ago, I don't know if I remember this, but for every 1% in inbreeding in sheep, we see a 2.68 reduction in lamb survival. Is that right? Lamb survival?
Come on, Tom.
And it just seemed like for something like that, that reduction, to see that, I think it's the internet, that multiplier is massive. 2.6, 2.7 for every 1%, that's massive. So where's all that mortality come from? And it just has to be, I always just thought it was just loss of embryos. Like they might conceive 3, but only deliver 2. And that it has to go fundamentally because lambs aren't dying they haven't been born and then die at that rate. I wouldn't think.
Right. I mean, you could be getting those deleterious recessives that you're never seeing, right? So they lose the lamb or.
From his class that predicted the impact of 12.5% inbreeding on lamb survival. And it was like a third. And the suffix which are more highly than but that was from a 1991 abstract. So I
was having a hard time wrapping my head around that degree of mortality of live lambs.
Number of lambs removed for you or total weight of lamb removed for you is the trade. And so what goes into that is ewes that are inbred have lower fertility, they have lower co-lipids. So fewer of them are inbred, and give birth to less lambs that are inbred have lower survival. So in combination of all those traits, that's the question.
I would just want to reinforce the same thing you just mentioned. Where do we measure inbreeding? That's the important part. It's one thing to measure it in a purebred seed stock flock versus in a commercial flock. And really, there should be no purebred commercial flocks because they're losing, the ability to access heterosis, which I think research shows right there at the Sheep Center that, a terminal sire on an F1U increases pounds of lamb fleet almost 28 to 30%. So, it's one of those things where as long as you can keep it where you're not getting a huge amount of inbreeding depression in the purebred flocks, I think sometimes these animals that are a little more inbred, like hybrid seed corns, 2 highly inbred lines cross to produce, to get optimum hybrid vigor. That, I think I have to be careful to say that inbreeding is a total negative.
I didn't say that.
Right. You got to understand how it can be applied and used.
Of course, right. Well, I presume that I'm speaking to a room of seed stock producers, but yes, definitely at the commercial level, this should not be an issue.
Yeah, quick follow-up to so is there a value? So let's say you've got a relatively highly inbred ram, really good traits. Is there value, like maybe using them on a commercial flock, or does he have value?
Of course, and then if you're not keeping, right, so mating decisions, that's how you manage inbreeding, right? So if you're crossing him on a commercial flock and those animals aren't being retained, then you've totally mitigated the whole inbreeding issue.
Thank you for your questions. This thing carry again.